Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania is very bad. We're just going to get that out of the way right at the beginning. And not only is it bad on its own, I think it shows kind of how the MCU is irreparably in decline. So, spoiler alert for Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, let's talk about it. Alright, so on a plot level, I have to say, the story is basically non-existent. Nothing really happens during the course of this movie. Basically, the characters from Ant-Man and the Wasp get sucked into the quantum realm, which I think is my first gripe with the writing in this movie. They don't really choose to actually enter the conflict or the plot of this movie. They just kind of miraculously get sucked into the quantum realm so all the plot events can happen. They just find this new crowd of these faceless CGI creatures, and the end result of this film is absolutely no progression in any storylines whatsoever. There won't be any consequences to the plot of this film. To be clear, there may be sort of consequences on paper as a result of the events of this movie, but they're not going to be unique to this movie. Wherever Kang starts out in the next movie that he appears in, it's going to be exactly where he could have started out at the beginning of this movie. Captain America: Civil War is a great movie because when you look at the events of the entire MCU, Civil War's actions had lasting consequences on the world. And by contrast, Quantumania is not going to have any of those kinds of consequences. It's a completely lightweight filler of a movie. You know, I actually thought they were going to do something kind of interesting by leaving Ant-Man and the Wasp stranded in the quantum realm at the end of the movie, sort of sacrificing their way home to stop Kang from getting out. And, you know, I don't think that would have made this a good movie, but at least the ending would have been interesting. They don't. They just kind of leave. They make a whole big deal about how Kang can't get out, and then they stop him, and there are no costs to stopping him whatsoever. They just leave, and everything's fine. On a self-contained level, not related to the rest of the series, the plot of this movie doesn't make very much sense. Spoiler alert for this movie, Kang gets defeated when Hank brings a huge-ass crowd of ants to fight him. Kang the Conqueror, who is going to be like the next Thanos in this movie, gets beaten by ants. The first hour and 10 minutes of this movie are completely pointless. The characters just get chased around by like ships and weird creatures, and they meet these like Star Wars cantina looking people for like an hour and 10 minutes, and nothing of consequence happens in this section of the movie. As soon as Kang enters the picture as an actual character and confronts Ant-Man, and the two of them start talking, that's what was for me the most interesting part of this movie, and that was at the halfway point. They kind of mumble out some backstory for Kang. They try to pretend that that mumbled out backstory is an actual identifiable motive for him to do all the things that he's doing. Like, why does Kang want to leave the quantum realm? He says he wants to conquer and get revenge on the people who, you know, wronged him, but we never saw that happen to him. He just kind of told us. So we don't really know like how that actually affected him, what his life was like before. So it's kind of hard to understand Kang at all because they don't really do a good job of actually developing like why he's doing what he's doing. That ultimately gets to my main gripe with Kang. I think they needed to make him more understandable. Thanos was obviously like, you know, a madman, but he was understandable given what had happened to his homeworld. He had found what he thought was a solution to the problem that had destroyed his home, and so it was at least reasonable, if not like sensible. Kang is just like, I want to leave and conquer because I'm a conqueror. I think this gets into sort of the main problems with Kang as a villain, at least right now. It seems like if they wanted to do an interpretation of Kang, they should have taken inspiration from the comics that he appears in, but I think they should have built the character from the ground up in terms of backstory and motivation. Right now, it kind of just feels like they cut and pasted some guy from the comic books into a movie, and I think you can play a lot more fast and loose with characters in comics than you can with movie characters. We kind of expect the writers of movies to show us like why our characters want to act a certain way. And we might kind of just accept the fact that, oh, the villain of this comic book wants to destroy the world because like that's what comic book villains do. So I think instead of making a comic book villain and then make a movie about him, what they needed to do was create their own movie villain. Thanos was a good movie villain. He was intimidating, he was understandable, he was dangerous. He didn't lose a fight until the entire forces of the Avengers and all like the side characters in the entire MCU united together to put him down. Kang lost in his first movie, so he loses any kind of menace that he could have had. It's sort of the Kylo Ren problem, where Kylo Ren loses every fight in the entire sequel trilogy, so you don't really like fear him as a threat. We saw Ant-Man and the Wasp beat Kang in what was essentially a fist fight. Now keep in mind, the only people who could even kind of attempt to go one-on-one with Thanos in the Infinity Saga were Captain America, Iron Man, Thor, kind of the Hulk, Doctor Strange, kind of Captain Marvel for some reason. Those were, with some notable exceptions, the main characters of the Infinity Saga. And to me, I think this gets into sort of what's wrong with the MCU up until this point. So put a pin in that thought about main characters. We're going to come back to that at the end. As far as the writing of the dialogue goes, it was pretty average, I would say. I will say, any kind of chemistry between Janet and Hank is just completely unbelievable, very forced. All the jokes felt very forced. I don't think I really laughed more than one or two times, despite them constantly trying to shove quippy one-liners down my throat. There's a scene in this movie where Scott like doesn't know if he can do the thing he needs to do, and then Cassie like gets on the microphone and starts saying like vaguely encouraging like words of motivation, and that allows him to like overcome his inability to actually like do the action of the plot, and he rises up and like does the thing he needs to do. It's so like Disney Channel-esque that like people are giving motivational speeches that are impacting like the course of plot events. Ultimately, my main gripe with the writing, I think, is that this is such a huge missed opportunity. I think what was lacking in Love and Thunder, for example, is that it didn't feel like the movie was relying very heavily on like the events of the past movies. Like it wasn't really doing a good job to kind of fulfill that arc. And I think this movie kind of does the same thing. I think it could have been really interesting to explore how much losing those years of Cassie growing up had hurt Scott as a dad. He had lost like her entire childhood. And I think getting that time back could have been a major temptation for him. Right? I think it would have been really cool to explore that more, but at the beginning of the movie, they don't really make you feel like Scott has gone through this great loss from losing her childhood. He's just like very passive aggressive with his daughter. It doesn't feel like he's trying to get over some kind of grief, and I think it would have been really interesting to see Kang actually tempt Scott with the possibility of reliving those years that he had lost. They could have done so much more with like that part of his story. Frankly, I think Ant-Man probably should have died in this movie, and they could have just kind of sent off the character that way, because I don't really know how many more stories there are to tell about Ant-Man. As far as the acting goes, I was decently impressed with this movie. I think everyone does a fine job, except Paul Rudd, who seems like he's really phoning it in at this point. Jonathan Majors as Kang, though, really good. He gives like a much quieter, a little bit more understated performance than I expected, and it's a pretty menacing result. I thought he did a really good job. As far as the visual style, everything in this movie is just, this entire movie is just CGI. Like which is fine. The CGI is good, but like I'm just not impressed by that anymore. I think at this point, I wish that like one shot of the quantum realm had actually looked like it was in a real place instead of like this kind of nebulous green screen background. The fight scenes were fine. The fight scene between Ant-Man and Kang, where it was like a fist fight, that was actually pretty well done. The chase scenes in this movie are just completely played out. They take way too long. Again, they take up a huge chunk of the first part of this movie is just people getting chased around and nothing happens as a result of them. I think when you have this much CGI, everything feels really like floaty and weightless. Like nothing seems like it moves or like lands the way that you want it to. It's fine, right? The movie looks fine on a technical level. It's just like it just doesn't feel interesting to watch. Okay, so that was all my general critiques of this movie. I give it a 3 out of 10 based on this rubric that I've made. To make a quick point about what I think the problem is with the MCU as a whole, and I think this movie kind of made me think about this quite a bit. Phase 4 and beyond has no main characters. By this point in the Infinity Saga, 8 movies in, we were 3 Iron Mans in, 2 Thors in, we had an Avengers movie in, there was a second Captain America movie about to hit theaters. Those were our main characters, and their arcs had kind of been developed a little bit as the series went on. We knew the series was going to feature some side characters, but the real development was going to be done with that small group of characters. That's really good. That's what this saga needs. Every single movie that's been announced for phases 4 and 5 at this point tells a different character story. So we keep getting these like weirdly inconsequential origin stories like Eternals or like Shang-Chi, or these kind of standalone nothing burgers like Love and Thunder or Wakanda Forever or Quantumania. The only movie that proves to have any future consequences is No Way Home. Maybe Multiverse of Madness gives us something, but based on the ending and the post-credit scene, it seems like it's more like a setup for Doctor Strange 3 than any kind of world-changing thing here. At the very least, by this point, I think we should have had another Avengers movie where by now our main characters have met up, they're working together, but we don't know who's important and who isn't. So every time a new TV show gets put out onto the market, every time a new movie comes out, it's like, this is another character who may be important, may not be. We don't know how it all ties together. And I think by this point in phase 1 and phase 2, they were sort of giving us an idea of how everything fit together. Our characters were working together. We kind of saw where their arcs were headed. Nobody who's important has met the other people at this point, and it's been like 3 years into phase 4 and 5. And when you have this lack of main characters, you end up with movies that lack consequences, like I was talking about at the beginning. Nothing in the universe is going to change because of the events of this movie. Yeah, Kang is now a threat we know about, but honestly, they could have introduced him in any other movie and it would have had just as much impact. Think about the fact that the Avengers, the Battle of New York, shapes the plot for the other movies going forward. Winter Soldier, that whole thing with S.H.I.E.L.D. dissolving and, finding Hydra has been kind of infiltrating S.H.I.E.L.D. That has lasting consequences for the rest of the characters. Civil War has huge consequences. Infinity War, huge consequences. Age of Ultron, huge consequences. All these movies were actually changing the landscape that these characters were sharing. Phases 4 and 5, they exist within this big connected universe, but there's nothing connecting these people so far. There's no events that characters in separate movies are sharing in common. The Eternals basically destroyed half the planet and nobody even says anything about it. This is why I would hesitantly say I think the MCU is dead. I think they needed at the beginning of phase 4 to reset, give us some new main characters, and start developing their arcs. But they didn't do that. They decided they were going to just put out 900 movies and TV shows onto the market, all of which were seemingly connected, but in reality completely disconnected and expect people to follow all of those things. That's not going to happen. I was kind of excited for this whole Kang thing, and I thought the multiverse would maybe pull all these stories that were kind of disparate together, but they haven't given me any main characters. Nobody is going through an arc, and we're 8 movies in. So I would hesitantly say the MCU is only going to get worse from here. Marvel's starting to realize, I think, that their model of putting out as much content as possible instead of worrying about the impact of that content isn't working. I know I just read an article a couple days ago that said they were going to slow down their production schedule for Phase 5, but I think the problem is not slowing down the movies that are coming out in the future. The problem was you had an opportunity at the beginning of Phase 4 to start telling some new stories, and you just decided not to do that. And now it's too late to go back. So yeah, Quantumania, really bad, and the MCU, I think, is probably safely on the decline at this point. Thanks for watching.